Between the mist-shrouded forests of northern Europe and the windswept steppes of Central Asia, a remarkable people began to emerge from the scattered tribes of the Bronze Age collapse. Around 2000 BC, groups speaking an early Indo-European dialect settled in river valleys and woodland clearings, planting the seeds of what would one day become a distinctive Slavic identity. These early settlers could never have imagined that their modest beginnings would eventually blossom into civilizations spanning vast territories. From the Baltic Sea to the Balkans, the landscape shaped every aspect of their developing worldview. Dense woodlands, where sunlight barely penetrated the canopy even at midday, created realms of shadows and whispers. Rivers wound through marshlands so vast that travelers could wander for days without finding solid ground. Winter brought months of darkness and bitter cold that tested the survival of every settlement. In this challenging environment, a spiritual perspective naturally emerged that recognized powerful entities inhabiting every tree, stone, and flowing stream. Unlike their nomadic cousins who roamed the open grasslands, or their southern neighbors who built stone temples in warmer climates, these proto-Slavic tribes developed intimate connections with their forested homeland. Settlements clustered along riverbanks, their inhabitants constructing semi-subterranean houses that provided protection from harsh winters. Cremation became the preferred method for disposing of the dead, with ashes scattered in flowing water or buried beneath trees that would grow nourished by the deceased. This cycle of return to nature reflected a fundamental understanding of life's continuity. The Przeworsk culture, flourishing in modern Poland between 200 BC and 200 AD, left compelling evidence of these developing devotional practices. Excavated sites reveal ritual deposits of weapons thrown into rivers, carefully arranged animal bones from ceremonial feasts, and ceramic vessels decorated with solar and lunar symbols. These weren't simply superstitious gestures, but sophisticated expressions of a worldview that recognized the sacred dimension permeating everyday existence. Unlike their Germanic neighbors who emphasized individual warrior burials, these tribes practiced collective cremation ceremonies that reflected their belief in the continued presence of ancestors within the community. Further east, along the winding course of the Dnieper River, the Zarubintsy culture developed similar but distinct practices. Settlement patterns followed river systems, with sacred sites strategically located on elevated ground overlooking major waterways. The artifacts recovered from these locations tell a fascinating story. Pottery fragments show evidence of ritual breaking during funeral ceremonies, while bronze items bear engravings of animals, trees, and flowing water that represented the interconnected nature of all existence. These weren't merely decorative elements, but visual expressions of a complex cosmology. The harsh climate influenced spiritual development as profoundly as geography. Short growing seasons meant that agricultural success depended on precise timing and favorable weather conditions. Villages developed elaborate observances tied to solar and lunar cycles, carefully tracking celestial movements to determine optimal planting and harvesting times. These weren't primitive superstitions, but practical systems that merged spiritual reverence with survival necessities. Seasonal festivals marked the critical transitions between winter survival and spring renewal, summer abundance, and autumn preparation. Within their dwelling spaces, families maintained small household shrines, in corners where they tended fires and left offerings for protective spirits. These domestic devotional practices centered around the hearth, which served as both cooking facility and sacred center where the family's supernatural guardian resided. The rhythms of daily life intertwined with spiritual observance, feeding the fire with specific types of wood, scattering grain around the hearth and speaking directly to the invisible protector who watched over the home's inhabitants. These weren't separate religious activities, but integral parts of household management. The development of language reflected this spiritual thinking in fascinating ways. Proto-Slavic vocabulary emphasized concepts of protection, abundance, and seasonal change. Words for supernatural beings derived naturally from everyday activities. The domovoi came from dom, meaning house, while rusalka connected to rosa, meaning dew. This linguistic pattern reveals how mystical concepts emerged organically from direct observation of natural phenomena, rather than abstract theological speculation. The very words people spoke carried embedded spiritual meanings. Metallurgical advancement accompanied this spiritual evolution step by step. Bronze weapons received ritual treatment before and after use, with specific ceremonies for blessing blades and returning damaged items to the earth through river deposits. When iron tools appeared around 700 BC, they underwent similar consecration processes that connected human craftsmanship to supernatural forces. Smiths occupied special positions within settlements, their ability to transform raw materials through fire, marking them as intermediaries between earthly and divine realms. Technology and spirituality developed hand in hand. Trade networks carried devotional influences as readily as material goods across vast distances. Amber from Baltic shores reached villages hundreds of miles inland, valued not only for its beauty, but for its supposed ability to trap supernatural energy. Glass beads from distant workshops adorned ritual garments and served as protective amulets. Exotic materials like silver and precious stones became associated with divine power and ceremonial significance. Commerce created connections that spread spiritual innovations alongside technological advancements. Burial practices evolved throughout this formative period, reflecting changing concepts about death and the afterlife. Early simple cremations gradually gave way to more elaborate ceremonies, involving multiple stages of body preparation, tribal feasting, and memorial construction. Barrow mounds began appearing over important graves, creating permanent markers that connected specific locations to ancestral presence. These burial sites became pilgrimage destinations where descendants returned to seek guidance and maintain family connections across generations. The role of animal sacrifice grew increasingly important in tribal observances. Horses, cattle, and sheep were ceremonially slaughtered during seasonal festivals, their meat shared among participants while specific portions were carefully offered to supernatural forces. Archaeological evidence from ritual sites shows systematic disposal of animal bones in patterns that suggest elaborate ceremonial protocols. Different species carried distinct symbolic meanings. Horses connected to sky gods and solar cycles, cattle to earth deities and agricultural abundance, sheep to protective spirits and household prosperity. Specialized practitioners emerged who served as essential intermediaries between human settlements and the spirit world. These individuals, known by various titles that would eventually evolve into the term Volkvi, underwent rigorous training in altered consciousness techniques, herbal medicine, and ritual performance. Their services included weather prediction, healing ceremonies, and communication with deceased relatives who continued influencing family affairs from beyond death. These weren't merely religious figures, but community resources who provided crucial services. Astronomical observation became increasingly sophisticated as communities required accurate calendars for agricultural and ceremonial purposes. Stone circles and wooden post arrangements marked solar and lunar positions, enabling precise timing of seasonal ceremonies. These observational sites often became permanent sacred centers, where larger gatherings could take place during important celestial events. The heavens themselves provided both practical guidance and spiritual inspiration to these developing societies. Contact with neighboring peoples introduced new concepts while reinforcing existing practices. Germanic tribes to the west contributed ideas about fate and cosmic destiny that influenced developing Slavic concepts of predetermined life paths. Celtic groups provided models for sacred grove worship and water veneration that matched existing tendencies in Proto-Slavic thinking. Steppe nomads brought sky god concepts and horse sacrifice rituals that would eventually shape major deity development. Cultural exchange enriched rather than diminished native traditions. As Proto-Slavic populations spread across diverse environments, regional differentiation inevitably emerged. Northern settlements, living in dense forests with short growing seasons, developed practices emphasizing tree spirits and winter survival. Southern groups, occupying river valleys with longer agricultural periods, focused more on fertility deities and harvest celebrations. Western villages, in contact with increasingly organized neighboring societies, began developing more structured hierarchies. Geography and climate created distinctive regional variations within the broader cultural framework. Social stratification accompanied spiritual development, with certain families acquiring hereditary roles as ritual specialists, weather predictors, and keepers of traditional knowledge. These emerging leaders accumulated sacred objects, maintained tribal shrines, and conducted ceremonies that required specialized training. Their influence extended beyond purely mystical matters to include dispute resolution, marriage arrangements, and community decision-making. Spiritual authority translated naturally into broader social leadership. Military organization reflected this spiritual thinking at every level, with warrior bands conducting elaborate ceremonies before combat that invoked supernatural protection and demonstrated tribal solidarity. Weapons received blessing through ritual exposure to sacred fires, flowing water, or specific astronomical conditions. Victory celebrations included thanksgiving offerings to the spirits who had granted success, while defeat prompted careful examination of ritual failures that might have angered protective deities. Warfare carried spiritual dimensions as significant as its practical aspects. Craft production incorporated devotional elements at every stage, from material selection through final completion. Potters added sacred symbols to their vessels. Weavers included protective patterns in their textiles, and woodworkers chose trees according to ritual calendars. These practices created objects that served both practical and supernatural functions, embedding mystical concepts into the most ordinary items of daily life. The boundary between sacred and secular simply didn't exist in this integrated worldview. By 500 AD, Proto-Slavic systems had developed sufficient complexity to support the more elaborate pantheons and institutional structures that would characterize the medieval period. Basic concepts about household protection, seasonal observance, and ancestral veneration provided foundations for the organized temple complexes and state systems that would emerge during the following centuries. Yet even as practices became more sophisticated, they retained the essential connection to natural forces and environmental cycles that had shaped Slavic consciousness from its earliest development. The Great Migration periods between 500 and 800 AD carried these concepts across vast territories as Slavic groups spread into previously unsettled regions. Each migration created opportunities for adaptation as populations encountered new environments, neighboring peoples, and survival challenges. Yet core elements remained remarkably consistent. The emphasis on household spirits, seasonal ceremonies, and the complex relationships between living settlements and their deceased ancestors, who continued participating in family and tribal affairs. The seeds planted in those ancient forest clearings would eventually blossom into one of Europe's most distinctive cultural traditions. Scattered woodland shrines began transforming into elaborate ceremonial centers as tribal chieftains consolidated power and populations grew throughout the early medieval period. Between 500 and 800 AD, simple nature worship evolved into organized pantheons, featuring distinct personalities with specific domains and elaborate mythological relationships. Oak groves that had once hosted modest family gatherings now accommodated hundreds of worshippers during major festivals, their ancient trees supporting massive wooden idols that dominated the landscape. Perun emerged as the supreme deity of this developing hierarchy, his authority encompassing thunderstorms, military victory, and cosmic justice. Unlike the vague sky forces worshipped by earlier generations, this thunder god possessed clear personality traits, predictable behavior patterns, and specific ritual requirements. Warriors carved his symbol, a six-pointed star or stylized thunderbolt, into their weapons and shields. Farmers watched his lightning illuminate summer storms that brought the rains essential for successful harvests. Oak trees became Perun's earthly manifestations, their massive trunks and spreading branches serving as natural temples where worshippers gathered to witness supernatural power. Lightning strikes that splintered these giants were interpreted as signs of the thunder deity's presence rather than random natural events. Priests collected pieces of lightning-struck wood, grinding them into powder for protective charms or incorporating them into ritual fires that connected earthly observances to celestial forces. Veles ruled the underworld, the marshlands, and the realm of the dead from his position as the thunder god's cosmic opponent. This cattle deity appeared in multiple forms, sometimes as an enormous serpent coiled around the roots of the world tree, sometimes as a shaggy bear emerging from hibernation, sometimes as a bearded herdsman whose livestock included both living animals and human souls. His domain encompassed everything that existed below the Earth's surface or beyond the boundaries of civilized settlements. Between these two primordial forces, eternal conflict generated the natural phenomena that governed mortal existence. When Veles stole the Thunderlord's cattle, the rain clouds that grazed in heavenly pastures, the sky ruler's pursuit shook the heavens with lightning and deafening crashes. Their battles explained weather patterns, seasonal changes, and the agricultural cycles that determined whether populations prospered or starved. Victory meant abundant rains and successful harvests. Defeat brought drought, crop failure, and famine. Winter represented Veles's annual triumph, when the underworld deity retreated to his subterranean palace and locked the earth in frozen silence. Spring announced the thunder, God's return to dominance, his thunderbolts awakening dormant seeds and calling forth new growth. Summer marked the height of their struggle, when violent storms demonstrated the cosmic forces that maintained universal balance. Autumn brought resolution as the harvest was gathered, and the cycle prepared to begin anew. Regional variations of this central myth reflected local environmental conditions and cultural influences. Western Slavic territories, where Germanic contact had introduced concepts of organized warfare and territorial conquest, developed elaborate military aspects of celestial conflict. Eastern regions, dominated by vast river systems and agricultural plains, emphasized the water-stealing episodes and their connection to irrigation and farming success. Svetovid gained particular prominence among the Baltic Slavs, his four faces representing his ability to observe all directions simultaneously. Unlike other deities who might appear in various forms, this war god maintained consistent iconography. 4 bearded faces arranged around a central head, each looking toward a cardinal direction, symbolizing comprehensive awareness and absolute authority over territorial defense. At Arkona, on Rugen Island, Svetovid's temple dominated the landscape like a wooden cathedral. Massive timber walls enclosed a sanctuary large enough to accommodate thousands of worshippers during major gatherings. Inside, the god's statue rose 30 feet toward the vaulted ceiling, its 4 faces carved with expressions that ranged from benevolence to terrifying wrath, depending on the viewer's perspective and the lighting conditions. Consecrated horses grazed in pastures surrounding the temple complex, their behavior interpreted as supernatural communication about military and agricultural prospects. Before major campaigns, priests conducted elaborate divination rituals involving these animals. A white stallion would be led through arrangements of spears, shields, and other weapons, while observers noted its reactions. Confidence and steady movement indicated approval for military action. Hesitation or fear suggested that campaigns should be postponed until more favorable omens appeared. Annual festivals at Arkona drew participants from across the Baltic region, temporarily transforming the island into a major commercial and ceremonial center. Ships crowded the harbors, while overland travelers created bustling temporary markets where goods from Scandinavia, the German territories, and the Slavic interior were exchanged alongside devotional objects and ritual materials. Eastern territories developed different personalities, adapted to their distinctive environments and cultural needs. Dazbog, whose name meant giving god, ruled the sun and controlled the abundance that flowed from solar energy. Each dawn marked his birth from cosmic waters. Each sunset represented his death and journey through the underworld to achieve rebirth the following morning. Solar symbolism appeared throughout material culture in regions where Dazbog received particular veneration. 6-pointed stars decorated pottery, jewelry, and architectural elements. Circular motifs representing the sun's daily journey adorned weapons and ceremonial objects. Fire festivals marked solstices and equinoxes with elaborate observances that maintained connections between earthly flames and their celestial source. Strybog commanded the winds, his breath filling the sails of merchant vessels and carrying the scents that announced seasonal changes. Sailors cast coins into harbor waters as offerings for favorable voyages. Millers constructed shrines beside their facilities, where wind power ground grain into flour that sustained entire populations. Hunters learned to interpret his voice in rustling leaves that might reveal the locations of game animals. Makosh stood alone among major deities as the primary feminine force, her authority encompassing fertility, textile production, and women's mysteries. Her worship continued much older goddess traditions that stretched back to Neolithic agricultural societies, suggesting that female supernatural power had deeper historical roots than the male sky gods who dominated the emerging pantheon. Women gathered at Mokosh's shrines during lunar celebrations, bringing offerings of bread, honey, and freshly woven cloth, while seeking assistance with pregnancy, childbirth, and family protection. Her cult maintained particular secrecy, with observances conducted away from male observers and holy knowledge transmitted through maternal lineages that preserved feminine wisdom across generations. Elaborate temple complexes began appearing across the landscape as these personalities gained political support and accumulated material resources. Prince Vladimir's construction project in Kiev around 980 AD represented the culmination of this architectural development, systematically organizing the Pantheon into a clear hierarchy that reflected both theological understanding and political authority. Within this complex, the thunder god's statue dominated the arrangement, his silver head and golden mustache, demonstrating the wealth and craftsmanship that devotional populations could mobilize for heavenly honor. Surrounding deities, Kors, Dazbog, Strybog, Simargl, and Mokosh, were positioned according to their rank in the cosmic hierarchy, their relative sizes and decorative elaboration indicating their importance within the official system. Consecrated fires burned continuously before these images, consuming enormous quantities of wood, aromatic substances, and valuable offerings. Smoke rising from these perpetual flames carried prayers skyward, while announcing to observers that the settlement possessed supernatural favor and protection. Maintenance of these fires required specialized knowledge about different types of fuel, proper timing of feeding schedules, and the symbolic significance of various aromatic additions. Human sacrifice marked the most solemn ritual occasions, when populations offered their most valuable possessions, human lives, to ensure supernatural protection during critical periods. Prisoners captured in warfare provided the usual victims, their deaths serving both theological and political purposes. The ritual killing demonstrated the settlement's absolute commitment to their gods, while eliminating enemies who might otherwise threaten future security. Evidence from sites like Gross Raiden reveals the material culture surrounding these practices. Ritual knives with elaborate silver handles, bronze cauldrons large enough to contain human bodies, and specially constructed platforms designed for sacrificial observances show the sophisticated infrastructure that supported organized temple worship. Volkvi evolved from village wise men into professional priests with standardized training and hierarchical organization. These specialists devoted their entire lives to mastering the complex ritual requirements of organized worship, learning to memorize vast quantities of oral literature, astronomical calculations, and ceremonial procedures that maintained proper relationships between human societies and supernatural forces. Training began in childhood and continued through multiple stages of initiation that gradually revealed deeper levels of holy knowledge. Apprentices learned basic procedural requirements, seasonal observances, and protective techniques, before advancing to more complex practices involving weather magic, healing arts, and communication with supernatural beings. Advanced practitioners specialized in particular areas of service. Some focused on military applications, providing support for warrior bands and conducting battlefield observances that invoked supernatural protection. Others concentrated on agricultural concerns, timing planting and harvesting according to celestial cycles, while performing rituals that encouraged favorable weather and abundant yields. Political influence accompanied ritual authority, as these priest specialists became essential advisors to tribal leaders and emerging princes. No major military campaign commenced without consulting the Volkvi about auspicious timing, appropriate sacrifices, and protective measures needed to ensure supernatural support. Marriage alliances, trade agreements, and territorial disputes all required celestial sanction obtained through proper ritual procedures. Competition between different priestly lineages sometimes produced spectacular demonstrations of supernatural power, as rival groups attempted to prove their superior connections. Chronicles record contests where opposing Volkvi tried to control weather patterns, heal incurable diseases, or predict future events with greater accuracy than their competitors. Seasonal festivals provided opportunities for entire populations to participate in the cosmic dramas enacted by their deities. Winter solstice celebrations honored the gradual return of solar power and the promise that spring would eventually overcome winter's deadly grip. Spring festivals celebrated the thunder god's victory over winter and the renewal of life throughout the natural world. Summer festivals reached their peak during the period of longest daylight, when solar power achieved its annual maximum. Fire-jumping rituals tested the courage of young warriors, while communal feasts demonstrated the abundance that supernatural favor had brought to faithful worshippers. Autumn festivals marked the completion of agricultural cycles and preparation for winter's return. International trade carried ritual influences along with material goods, spreading innovations in worship techniques and mythological understanding across vast distances. Merchants served as informal missionaries, introducing new personalities and procedural practices to settlements along their commercial routes. Military observances became increasingly elaborate, as warrior bands developed sophisticated rituals for invoking supernatural protection and demonstrating tribal solidarity. Consecrated weapons received blessing through processes that allegedly imbued them with supernatural properties, while pre-battle rituals established connections between human fighters and the cosmic forces that determined victory or defeat. By the 10th century, this organized pantheon provided the supernatural foundation for increasingly powerful political entities that could challenge neighboring kingdoms and empires. Magnificent temples dominated major settlements, their wooden spires rising above surrounding buildings like ancient skyscrapers. Priestly colleges accumulated wealth and influence that rivaled royal courts, while seasonal festivals created temporary cities focused entirely on ritual celebration. Yet even at its height, this structured hierarchy remained firmly connected to the ancient nature worship that had given it birth. The thunder deity still inhabited individual oak trees, as well as elaborate temple complexes. Household spirits continued their protective duties in peasant dwellings. Local streams and springs maintained their individual personalities, despite being incorporated into the domains of major river deities. This continuity between organized religion and folk practice would prove crucial for survival during the coming centuries of political and cultural transformation. While princes erected magnificent temples and Volkvi conducted elaborate state ceremonies, an older and more intimate supernatural order continued governing the most fundamental aspects of human existence. Every dwelling harbored invisible protectors, every workplace hosted its own guardian, and every natural environment contained beings whose cooperation determined whether families prospered or perished. These weren't distant deities requiring formal worship, but everyday companions who shared living spaces with their human charges. They demanded daily attention, seasonal offerings, and careful observance of ancient protocols that connected ordinary activities to the cosmic forces surrounding mortal life. Each household sheltered a domovoi, inherited through family bloodlines like ancestral property, passed from generation to generation. This diminutive figure, typically appearing as a small bearded man covered in grey fur, watched over domestic affairs with the intensity of a devoted grandfather. During daylight hours, he remained hidden behind stoves, beneath floorboards, or in the shadows of storage areas. After sunset, his activities became audible through the soft sounds of bare feet crossing wooden floors, kitchen utensils being quietly rearranged, or whispered conversations with household cats who served as his messengers and companions. Unlike the distant deities who required formal prayers and elaborate sacrifices, the domovoi thrived on simple gestures of daily consideration. A bowl of milk left beside the hearth before bedtime, breadcrumbs scattered near his favorite hiding places, or small portions of family meals set aside before eating, maintained the invisible contract between human inhabitants and their protective caretaker. These modest offerings demonstrated respect and ensured continued cooperation, from a being whose goodwill determined household harmony and daily fortune. His responsibilities extended far beyond basic housekeeping duties. While parents labored in distant fields, the domovoi monitored sleeping children, his invisible hands straightening tangled blankets and his gentle humming soothing troubled dreams. When thieves approached the property, he alerted families through mysterious sounds, creaking timbers, rattling windows, or the sensation of invisible fingers tugging at sleepers' hair. Illness among family members prompted him to gather healing herbs during nighttime expeditions, leaving carefully selected plants on windowsills where inhabitants would discover them at dawn. Yet this benevolent guardian possessed a volatile temperament that required constant management through careful observance of household traditions. Families that neglected his needs or violated his unspoken rules might experience systematic destruction of domestic tranquility. Milk would sour within hours, bread would develop mold overnight, cooking fires would refuse to ignite properly, and essential tools would vanish only to reappear in impossible locations. Family members might wake with their hair elaborately braided, discover their clothing turned inside out, or find mysterious scratches spelling out warnings in scripts only elderly relatives could interpret. Moving to new residences demanded elaborate negotiations to persuade the domovoi to relocate with his charges. Formal invitations delivered to empty rooms, favorite foods prepared and abandoned in the old dwelling as farewell gifts, and burning coals transported from the original hearth to the new location provided anchors that encouraged reluctant guardians to continue their protective services. Families who failed to observe these protocols risked spiritual abandonment, leaving themselves vulnerable to malevolent influences that proper guardianship would normally repel. Aquatic environments contained their own hierarchies of supernatural inhabitants, each species adapted to specific watery domains and behavioral cycles that reflected the complex relationship between humans and water sources. Rusalka embodied the life-giving properties of rivers and lakes, but their benevolence fluctuated dramatically according to seasonal conditions and human behavior. During early summer, when waters warmed and fish spawned in shallow areas, they appeared as beautiful maidens with flowing hair that resembled underwater vegetation. Their songs drifted across moonlit surfaces, calling to fishermen and boatmen with melodies that promised romance, prosperity, and otherworldly wisdom. Yet these same beings transformed into agents of death during Rusalka week, the dangerous period following Orthodox Pentecost, when the souls of drowned women returned to claim new victims. No longer content with their underwater existence, they emerged to dance in forest clearings near riverbanks, their pale forms moving through trees like mist given human shape. Men who witnessed these nocturnal gatherings might find themselves compelled to join the dancing, their feet following hypnotic rhythms until exhaustion sent them tumbling into dark waters, where patient Rusalka waited to drag them down to bone-built palaces beneath the surface. Defense against these perilous transformations required knowledge transmitted through generations of those who made their living from water. Iron fishing hooks worn as amulets could repel hostile aquatic beings, while wreaths of wild roses cast into streams during dangerous periods served as peace offerings that might satisfy their hunger for human contact without demanding actual lives. Experienced boatmen knew specific songs for crossing treacherous waters, melodies that acknowledged the Rusalka's power while asserting the singer's right to safe passage through their domain. Regional variations in Rusalka traditions reflected different environmental conditions and cultural influences across the vast Slavic territories. Northern communities, where ice locked waterways for months, described beings who retreated beneath frozen surfaces to weave nets from their own hair, creating soul traps for spring drowning victims. Southern regions, with warmer climates and abundant vegetation, portrayed Rusalka, who could assume the forms of any aquatic creature: fish, frogs, water birds, or even the swirling patterns of foam that marked hazardous currents. The Vodyanoi ruled deeper and more treacherous waters, mill ponds where grinding wheels turned beneath the surface, river crossings where travelers paid tolls in coins or blood, and deep pools where fishermen sought the most valuable catches. Unlike the sometimes helpful Rusalka, this master maintained essentially predatory relationships with human populations, offering services that invariably cost more than initially apparent to those who sought his aid. His appearance reflected dual nature as provider and destroyer of human fortunes. Sometimes he manifested as a prosperous merchant, dressed in fine clothing and generous with coins that turned to worthless debris by morning light. Other times, he appeared as a decrepit ancient whose green beard dripped constantly with moisture that never dried, whose eyes reflected drowning depths, and whose laughter echoed the gurgling of submerged springs. His underwater palaces supposedly contained vast collections of captured souls preserved in water-filled vessels, each available for bargaining with surface dwellers willing to meet his prices. Millers developed particularly complex relationships with the Vodyanoi, whose cooperation was essential for water-powered grain processing that sustained entire communities. Monthly tributes of bread, salt, and occasionally livestock ensured that mill wheels functioned smoothly and floods did not destroy carefully constructed dams and channels. In exchange, he might provide storm warnings, reveal locations of valuable objects lost in the water, or grant temporary protection to those who needed to traverse dangerous waterways during emergencies. Forest territories harbored the Leshy, whose authority extended over every growing thing within his verdant realm. Unlike household guardians, who generally cooperated with human inhabitants, this woodland sovereign embodied nature's fundamental indifference to mortal concerns. He might guide lost travelers to safety, or lead them deeper into trackless wilderness, depending entirely on his momentary disposition and their conduct during encounters with his forest domain. Physical descriptions of the Leshy varied dramatically between regions and individual witnesses, suggesting that his appearance adapted to local expectations and fears. Some described a giant whose head brushed treetops, his body covered in bark-like skin and hair flowing like moss. Others encountered a figure no larger than ordinary men, but possessed of eyes reflecting ancient forest depths, and a voice speaking through creaking branches and rustling leaves. This inconsistency wasn't mere storytelling variation, but reflected the being's fundamental nature as a shapeshifter. His abilities extended far beyond simple shapeshifting. The Leshy could manipulate the forest itself, causing familiar paths to vanish and reappear elsewhere, making clearings expand or contract according to his will, and arranging trees to create barriers or passages serving his purposes. Hunters who offended him might find their quarry perpetually just beyond range, arrows deflected by invisible obstacles, and their own tracks leading in circles despite confident navigation. Successful coexistence required knowledge of ancient protocols governing human interaction with forest environments. Hunters seeking entry to his domain left offerings at trees marked by unusual bark patterns or distinctive growth formations. Woodcutters understood which timber could be safely harvested and which remained protected by supernatural sanctions that made cutting attempts both futile and dangerous. Mushroom gatherers knew proper songs for announcing their presence and requesting permission to take only what survival required from his woodland treasury. Seasonal cycles strongly influenced the Leshy's behavior and appropriate methods for maintaining peaceful relations with this powerful being. Spring brought his most active period, when new growth demanded constant attention and territorial boundaries required reassertion after winter dormancy. Summer offered optimal opportunities for negotiating passage or gathering rights, as satisfaction with abundant growth made him more receptive to reasonable requests. Autumn demanded extreme caution, as approaching vegetation death often triggered aggressive responses to perceived territorial violations. Winter presented the greatest mystery, as the Leshy seemed to enter states that were neither true hibernation nor continued consciousness. Some traditions claimed he retreated to underground caverns where forest beings gathered to share stories and plan the following year's growth patterns. Others suggested he merged temporarily with dormant trees, his awareness distributed through root systems that remained active beneath frozen soil. This winter transformation reflected deeper understandings about natural cycles and environmental consciousness. Domestic environments beyond main dwellings harbored specialized guardians whose cooperation was essential for household prosperity. The bathhouse, serving both practical and ceremonial functions in Slavic culture, was ruled by the Bannock, whose temperament reflected bathing's dual nature as both purification and potentially hazardous activity involving vulnerable humans. Properly managed, the Bannock ensured that bathhouse fires burned safely. Steam rose to optimal levels for effective cleansing, and purification conducted before major holidays achieved intended effects. Users who followed established protocols, entering only during designated hours, maintaining appropriate silence, and leaving tributes of fresh birch branches or aromatic herbs, could expect his assistance and protection during this essential household activity. Yet bathhouse environments also presented unique dangers that this overseer might exploit if proper respect was not maintained. The combination of heat, steam, and nudity created conditions where boundaries between physical and supernatural realms became perilously thin. Bathers who ignored warnings, avoiding the bathhouse during certain lunar phases, refusing to enter alone after midnight, or failing to make protective gestures before beginning cleansing, might face challenges ranging from mild discomfort to genuine physical harm. Grain storage areas attracted the Avinic, whose vigilance protected harvested crops from natural decay and supernatural contamination. His cooperation ensured that grain remained dry and pest-free through long winter months. Seed stocks retained viability for spring planting, and food security remained intact despite various threats to stored provisions that could mean starvation for careless families. The Ovinic's divination abilities made him particularly valuable during harvest time, when decisions about crop storage and winter preparations required accurate predictions about weather patterns and food requirements. Experienced householders learned to interpret signs he provided: dust patterns settling on grain sacks, sounds emerging from storage areas during quiet nights, a mysterious rearrangement of tools that revealed hidden information about family health and future prospects. Yet his protective services came with strict requirements that could not be safely ignored by those who depended on his favor. Grain storage areas required maintenance according to ancient standards of cleanliness and organization that exceeded mere practical considerations. Specific observances were necessary before storing the first grain each autumn. Protective charms needed regular renewal, and violations of storage taboos, such as allowing strangers unsupervised access or using stored grain for non-sustenance purposes, could trigger responses threatening entire winter food supplies. Female domestic spaces attracted the Kikimora, particularly associated with textile production and the complex crafts that occupied women's time during winter months. Her expertise encompassed not only technical aspects of spinning, weaving, and embroidery, but also protective magic woven into textiles through specific patterns, color combinations, and timing of production stages according to lunar and seasonal cycles. Skilled craftswomen could earn the Kikimora's active cooperation through respectful treatment of tools and materials, proper workspace maintenance, and creation of items meeting her exacting standards for both technical excellence and supernatural appropriateness. Her approval manifested through improved product quality, increased production efficiency, and mysterious appearance of additional materials when supplies ran unexpectedly low during important projects. However, her critical judgment could make her a demanding and sometimes vengeful presence in homes where women failed to meet expectations or violated craft traditions. Sloppy work might be unraveled during the night. Inferior materials could become mysteriously tangled or stained, and repeated violations of craft traditions might result in complete disappearance of projects in progress, forcing craftswomen to restart entire undertakings from the beginning. Connections to deceased ancestors permeated all these supernatural relationships, as household and environmental guardians were intimately linked to family members who had died in previous generations. The domovoi often bore physical resemblances to deceased patriarchs, while aquatic and forest beings sometimes manifested features recognizable from recently departed, who had maintained strong connections to specific natural environments during their lifetimes. This ancestral dimension created additional layers of obligation and opportunity within supernatural relationships. Families who properly honored their dead through regular graveside visits, seasonal memorial feasts, and preservation of stories about departed relatives, found their guardians more cooperative and helpful. Conversely, those who neglected obligations to ancestors or failed to maintain proper relationships with the deceased might discover their protective companions becoming increasingly unreliable or actively hostile. The Nav represented the most dangerous aspect of these ancestral connections. Restless souls who had not received proper burial, died violently or unexpectedly, or maintained such strong attachments to earthly existence that they refused to accept their transition to the other world. These phantoms posed threats extending far beyond domestic inconvenience, as their presence could trigger illness, accidents, and misfortunes affecting entire settlements. Protection from Nav required both individual and collective responses from communities threatened by their presence. Families conducted regular feeding rituals known as giardi, elaborate feasts where deceased relatives were formally invited to share meals with living descendants. These gatherings served multiple functions: maintaining emotional connections with the dead, ensuring departed souls received proper nourishment in the other world, and demonstrating ongoing respect that encouraged peaceful coexistence between living and dead family members. Settlement-wide observances addressed larger threats posed by Nav, whose origins extended beyond individual family connections. Seasonal festivals included practices designed to appease restless dead. Protective charms received regular renewal throughout populated areas, and accounts about dangerous phantoms were retold to ensure each generation understood warning signs and appropriate responses when supernatural threats emerged from the other world. Healing traditions drew extensively on relationships with various classes of invisible beings, as illness was understood to result from supernatural imbalances requiring both physical and otherworldly remedies. Znakaki, wise women serving as community healers, maintained working relationships with household guardians, forest sovereigns, aquatic rulers, and ancestral forces whose cooperation was essential for effective treatment of disease and injury. Their diagnostic techniques included methods for determining which type of supernatural influence was causing specific symptoms, as different beings required different approaches to negotiation and appeasement. Home-related illnesses might be treated through offerings to the domovoi and ritual cleansing of domestic spaces. Forest origin ailments required gathering medicinal plants according to protocols, honoring the Leshy's authority and ensuring his cooperation with healing efforts. Water-related conditions demanded practices conducted at riverbanks or springs, where healers negotiated directly with aquatic beings for patients' recovery. Even as organized pantheons rose to prominence and state temples dominated urban landscapes, these intimate supernatural relationships continued governing the daily experiences that determined whether families survived and prospered. The invisible guardians who shared every meal, witnessed every craft project, and monitored every household routine remained far more immediate and practical than the distant deities honored during seasonal festivals. Their persistent influence would prove crucial for maintaining supernatural connections, even when political upheavals destroyed the elaborate religious institutions that had seemed so permanent and powerful. Ambitious rulers across Eastern Europe began wielding divine authority as a tool of political consolidation during the 10th century. Where tribal chieftains had once been content with local influence, emerging princes now commanded resources sufficient to construct monuments that proclaimed their celestial mandate across vast territories. Massive wooden idols rose above newly fortified capitals, their painted faces gazing over domains that stretched from Baltic shores to Black Sea grasslands, while elaborate priesthoods developed the institutional structures necessary to maintain state-sponsored veneration on an unprecedented scale. The Prince of Kiev embodied this transformation from regional warlord to divinely sanctioned monarch when he seized power in 980 AD through conquest and political maneuvering. Rather than simply maintaining existing local customs, the new ruler commissioned a complete reorganization of divine relationships that would reflect his expanded ambitions. Craftsmen were summoned to create a pantheon unlike anything previously seen in Eastern Europe, systematically arranging the scattered deities of his diverse subjects into a clear hierarchy that mirrored his own political authority. On a prominent hill overlooking the Dnieper River, workers erected an assembly of images that demonstrated both the wealth and theological sophistication of the kingdom. Perun's statue dominated the arrangement, his silver head and golden mustache gleaming in sunlight, while his wooden body was dressed in real garments that changed with seasonal cycles. Surrounding him stood representations of Kors, Dashbog, Strybog, Simargl, and Mokosh, each positioned according to their rank in the newly systematized hierarchy that would govern divine relationships throughout the realm. This calculated display served multiple diplomatic and domestic purposes. Foreign ambassadors visiting Kiev would witness the prosperity and organizational capability of a kingdom that could afford such elaborate monuments. Tribal leaders from distant regions would understand that submission to the prince meant incorporation into a cosmic system where their local deities occupied subordinate positions beneath Perun's supreme authority. Urban populations would see daily evidence of their ruler's special relationship with the forces controlling weather, warfare, and agricultural prosperity. Consecrated fires burned continuously before these images, consuming vast quantities of carefully selected wood, aromatic herbs, and valuable offerings that demonstrated the community's devotion and their prince's ability to command enormous resources for ceremonial purposes. Smoke rising from these perpetual flames carried prayers skyward while announcing to all observers that Kiev possessed divine favor, necessary for continued expansion and success in an increasingly competitive political landscape. Armed campaigns became elaborate enterprises, combining strategic planning with extensive divination and ceremonial preparation. before the prince's armies marched against Bulgarian territories. Khazar strongholds or Byzantine frontier fortresses. Volkovi conducted thorough consultations with the assembled Pantheon. Campaign timing, commander selection, and even specific tactical decisions required approval obtained through proper sacrificial procedures and omen interpretation that bound military actions to divine sanction. Victory celebrations reached spectacular heights when successful expeditions returned with captives and plunder. Contemporary chronicles describe occasions when hundreds of prisoners were killed simultaneously, their blood feeding the divine powers that had granted triumph, while their deaths served as warnings to any who might consider resistance. These mass executions were not merely expressions of cruelty, but calculated demonstrations of the cosmic forces supporting the ruler's authority and the consequences of opposing divinely sanctioned rule. Professional priesthoods replaced part-time village wise men, as the complexity of state veneration required full-time specialists supported by regular taxation rather than voluntary contributions. These clerical officials received extensive training in the intricate requirements of organized ceremonial practice, learning not only traditional songs and mythological narratives, but also the diplomatic skills needed to coordinate festivals, drawing participants from across the expanding territories under princely control. Seasonal celebrations evolved into massive gatherings that temporarily transformed Kiev into a pilgrimage destination, rivaling Constantinople or Rome in its ceremonial magnificence. During major festivals, thousands of visitors converged on the city, camping in sprawling temporary settlements beyond the fortified walls. Merchants from distant regions brought exotic goods to trade during these gatherings, while craftsmen displayed their finest work to potential patrons among the assembled nobility and foreign dignitaries. Architectural innovation reached new levels of sophistication as timber construction techniques developed to support increasingly ambitious projects. Engineers learned to create massive frameworks capable of supporting multi-story structures decorated with elaborate carvings and metalwork. The great hall where the prince held court incorporated divine symbolism throughout its design, from carved pillars representing the world tree to painted ceilings depicting cosmic battles between order and chaos that reinforced the ruler's role as divine agent. International diplomacy increasingly incorporated theological elements as Kiev's kingdom engaged with major medieval powers. When Byzantine emperors sought assistance, they had to acknowledge the legitimacy of the prince's traditional practices, despite hoping for eventual conversion. Islamic rulers from Volga Bulgar and Khazar territories negotiated treaties respecting doctrinal differences between their subjects and Kiev's people. Though both sides anticipated that conquest might eventually resolve these theological incompatibilities, trade relationships carried ceremonial influences along commercial routes, connecting Baltic amber markets with silk roads leading to Constantinople and beyond. Merchants served as informal missionaries, carrying stories and practices from one region to another. Blessed objects, amulets, vessels, and devotional artwork moved through these networks, spreading innovations in veneration techniques and representation across vast distances while creating complex webs of spiritual exchange. Meanwhile, Western regions where Germanic and Frankish influence had been growing developed different approaches to state-sponsored devotion. Rather than attempting the Kiev ruler's systematic organization of diverse traditions, Pelagian communities focused resources on magnificent temple complexes dedicated to specific regional deities, whose authority was already well established among local populations and required no princely mandate. Arkona, situated on Rugen Island, became the most renowned of these Western ceremonial centers. Svetovid's sanctuary, dominated the settlement like a wooden cathedral, its walls rising high above surrounding fortifications. Inside, the four-faced deity's statue commanded space large enough to accommodate hundreds of worshippers during major observances. The idol's multiple faces allowed him to observe all directions simultaneously, symbolizing his ability to protect his people from threats approaching by land or sea. Sanctuary wealth rivaled that of monasteries, accumulated through centuries of offerings, tribute payments, and profits from trade conducted under divine protection. Precious metals, rare textiles, and exotic goods from across northern Europe filled storage chambers requiring armed guards for security. This treasure served both practical and symbolic functions, funding expeditions while demonstrating material benefits flowing to communities, maintaining proper relationships with patron deities who rewarded devotion with prosperity. Warrior priests defended Arcona's precincts with intensity, matching knights protecting holy sites. These devotional soldiers combined extensive combat training with deep knowledge of ceremonial requirements, serving as both sanctuary guards and observance specialists. Their loyalty to Svetovid superseded obligations to secular rulers, creating parallel authority structures that sometimes competed with princely power for community allegiance and resources. Blessed horses grazed in pastures surrounding the complex, their behavior interpreted as communication about future combat and agricultural prospects. Before major decisions, clergy conducted elaborate divination involving these animals, observing their movements, eating patterns, and responses to various stimuli. These omens determined whether armies marched to war, crops should be planted in specific fields, and trade expeditions should depart for distant markets where dangers and opportunities awaited. Annual festivals transformed Arcona into temporary metropolises as pilgrims arrived from across the Baltic region seeking divine favor. Ships crowded harbors while their crews brought offerings and sought blessings for dangerous voyages across storm-prone northern seas. Overland travelers created bustling markets where goods from Scandinavia, German territories, and Slavic interior regions were exchanged alongside devotional artifacts and ceremonial materials that sustained spiritual practices. Great feasts concluding these festivals consumed enormous quantities of food and drink, creating temporary abundance, symbolizing prosperity that divine favor could bring to faithful communities. Cattle, pigs, and sheep were slaughtered by hundreds, their meat distributed to all participants regardless of social status. Honeymead flowed freely, while grain stores opened to provide bread for multitudes who had traveled to honor Svetovid and reinforce communal bonds through shared celebration. Competition between different ceremonial centers created dynamic tension, driving innovation in ritual practice and architectural design. Rulers sought to outdo rivals through increasingly spectacular displays of divine favor and material wealth. Arcona's festival's success prompted other communities to enhance their own celebrations, leading to escalating cycles of magnificence characterizing the final centuries of organized traditional religion as centers vied for prominence. Other major centers across the Baltic region developed distinctive approaches to temple organization and festival celebration. Rithra featured multiple temples arranged around a central lake that played important roles in divination ceremonies. Wollin became a major commercial center where religious and economic activities became thoroughly integrated, with temples controlling significant portions of maritime trade through divine sanction. Combat veneration reached particular sophistication among Baltic communities, where constant warfare with expanding kingdoms made divine support for battle operations urgently necessary. Warrior brotherhoods developed elaborate initiation rites, binding members through divine oaths, invoking terrible curses upon anyone betraying companions. These observances typically involved bloodletting, consumption of blessed substances, and vows connecting individual honor with cosmic forces that transcended earthly loyalties. Consecrated weapons received treatment through processes allegedly imbuing them with divine properties beyond mere metal and wood. Swords were forged during astrologically significant moments, blessed through elaborate procedures involving multiple deities, and given names reflecting their mystical characteristics. Archaeological discoveries have revealed weapons decorated with solar symbols, runic inscriptions invoking protection, and precious metal inlays, possibly containing sanctified substances that linked warrior to divine realm. Battle preparations required extensive consultation beyond simple prayers for victory. Commanders worked closely with priest advisors who understood divine factors influencing combat outcomes. Attack timing, formation selection, and weapon choices for specific engagements might depend on omens obtained through divination, conducted immediately before combat commenced, creating war practices thoroughly infused with supernatural dimensions. Victory celebrations provided opportunities for spectacular demonstrations of gratitude to divine powers granting success. Captured enemy weapons were cast into holy lakes and rivers as thanksgiving offerings, while enemy banners hung in sanctuary chambers as permanent monuments to celestial favor. High-ranking prisoners might be reserved for sacrificial observances, honoring gods while demonstrating consequences of opposing divinely sanctioned authority. Growing sophistication of traditional kingdoms inevitably brought contact with missionary activities spreading across Europe for centuries. Unlike gradual cultural infiltration characterizing earlier transitions, these encounters often involved direct political and armed confrontation between incompatible worldviews that could not easily coexist within the same territories without fundamental transformation of one or both systems. Missionaries arriving in Kiev, Novgorod, or Arkona were not simply offering alternative devotional practices, but challenging entire foundations of political authority in these traditional states. Kings and princes deriving legitimacy from special relationships with ancestral deities could not easily accommodate teachings declaring those same gods to be demons or illusions. Social hierarchies, legal systems, and economic structures were all intimately connected with divine traditions that the new faith explicitly sought to replace with its own cosmic order. Early missionary efforts achieved limited success among populations whose daily lives remained thoroughly integrated with traditional practices. Teachings about individual salvation and eternal life seemed less compelling than immediate practical benefits people obtained through relationships with household guardians, seasonal deities, and protective ancestors. Promises of future paradise could not easily compete with tangible assistance provided by divine forces, already active in their communities through generations of established relationship. However, political circumstances began shifting in ways eventually favoring the new faith's expansion across the region. Growing power of kingdoms like the Holy Roman Empire and Byzantium made alliance with these neighbors increasingly attractive to traditional rulers, facing pressure from multiple directions. Conversion might provide access to advanced technology, diplomatic support, and trade relationships, strengthening a kingdom's position relative to competitors still following ancestral practices. The Kiev prince himself began reconsidering theological options as political ambitions expanded beyond what traditional devotion could effectively support. While his reorganized Pantheon had served effectively for consolidating power within existing territories, further expansion would require incorporating populations with very different ceremonial traditions. The new faith offered universal frameworks that might unite diverse ethnic groups under single political and ecclesiastical authority, without regional variations that complicated governance. The famous account of the rulers' deliberations in 987 AD, whether historically accurate in details or not, reflects practical considerations influencing royal conversion decisions. Islamic envoys from Volga Bulgars offered sophisticated monotheistic alternatives to traditional polytheism, but alcohol prohibition allegedly prompted rejection, with the memorable declaration that drinking is the joy of the Rus. Jewish representatives from Khazar territories presented another monotheistic option, but their lack of territorial power made alliance strategically unattractive compared to larger empires. Catholic teachings, represented by envoys from the Holy Roman Empire, offered technological and military advantages, but came with papal authority potentially compromising royal independence. Orthodox doctrine, promoted by Byzantine ambassadors, provided similar benefits while promising greater autonomy for local church leadership. The alleged response of the prince's envoys to Constantinople's Hagia Sophia, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth," suggests aesthetic considerations also influenced this momentous decision alongside political calculations. Economic factors played crucial roles in conversion considerations as medieval trade networks expanded. Kingdoms following the new faith controlled the most profitable trade routes connecting northern Europe with Mediterranean regions. Conversion would provide access to these commercial networks, while eliminating theological barriers complicating business relationships between traditional and converted merchants. Material prosperity visible in these cities offered compelling evidence of practical benefits flowing from adopting new faith. Yet decisions to abandon traditional devotional practices were not taken lightly by rulers, understanding the enormous social and political disruption such changes would necessarily cause. The Pantheon the prince had carefully constructed represented not only personal convictions, but also entire foundations of political authority. Dismantling this system would require finding alternative sources of legitimacy, while managing inevitable resistance from populations whose daily lives remained thoroughly integrated with ancestral traditions. Considerations ultimately proved decisive in the ruler's conversion to Orthodox doctrine in 988 AD. His agreement to provide assistance to Byzantine Emperor Basil II in exchange for marriage to the emperor's sister, Anna, created political alliance requiring theological compatibility. Mass baptism of Kiev's population in the Dnieper River marked not only the prince's personal conversion, but the beginning of the end for organized traditional religion throughout Eastern Europe as state support transferred to the new faith. Destruction of the great Pantheon the ruler had erected less than a decade earlier sent shockwaves throughout the region. Perun's silver-headed idol was dragged through streets and cast into rivers, while crowds wailed and beat their breasts in grief. Other images were similarly destroyed or removed, their consecrated fires extinguished, and sanctuary precincts converted to new purposes that served the expanding church hierarchy, replacing the Volkovi. Yet even as great state temples fell to axes wielded in the name of the cross, and official pantheons crumbled into memory, deeper devotional traditions sustaining these communities for centuries proved far more resilient. Household guardians, seasonal celebrations, and protective practices governing daily life could not be eliminated through royal decree or destroyed through physical demolition. These traditions would adapt, survive, and eventually merge with the new faith to create complex syntheses characterizing Eastern European devotion for centuries to come. Smoke billowed from blazing sanctuaries across Eastern Europe as old gods fell to axes wielded in the name of the cross. Royal decrees commanded entire populations to abandon beliefs that had sustained their ancestors for millennia. Yet for every idol that toppled and every shrine that burned, desperate voices rose in defiance. Transformation from pagan kingdoms to orthodox principalities proved neither swift nor bloodless, as settlements that had honored their deities for centuries found themselves ordered to embrace an alien faith that promised salvation in another world, while threatening their connections to the spirits governing daily survival. Kiev's mass baptism in 988 AD marked only the beginning of a struggle that would rage for generations. While Prince Vladimir's subjects may have waded obediently into the Dnieper River to receive blessing from Byzantine priests, their hearts remained with the gods whose images had been dragged through streets and cast into waters. Official observances satisfied political requirements for alliance with Byzantium, but changing the religious allegiance of entire populations required far more than single-day rituals conducted at sword point. Defiance began almost immediately, though initially taking subtle forms that avoided direct confrontation with royal power. Households that had publicly embraced the new faith continued privately maintaining their old ways, leaving offerings for domovoi, conducting seasonal festivals in hidden locations, and preserving ancient songs and stories through careful oral transmission. Clandestine activities created parallel spiritual lives that existed alongside, and often contradicted officially mandated ecclesiastical duties. Rural areas, where central power exercised less direct control, became refuges for old ways that could not be openly maintained in urban centers. Village clergy, when they existed at all, often found themselves ministering to congregations that attended services while continuing to honor household spirits, seasonal forces, and protective ancestors through gatherings conducted in woodland clearings and family meetings beyond official oversight. Many of these rural priests, drawn from local populations, understood the impossibility of completely eliminating deeply rooted customs overnight. Some developed pragmatic approaches that accommodated inherited practices within broadly acceptable frameworks, focusing on preventing outright paganism while tolerating activities that could be interpreted as harmless folk customs. This flexibility often created tension with higher ecclesiastical authorities, who demanded more rigorous enforcement of conversion requirements. Volkvi, stripped of their official status and deprived of state support, evolved into underground leaders who maintained old knowledge while adapting their methods to survive in hostile environments. These displaced priest-sorcerers could no longer conduct public observances or maintain elaborate temple complexes, but they preserved essential techniques of weather magic, healing arts, and communication with the spirit world through networks of loyal followers who secretly supported their activities. Some wise men chose direct confrontation with the new order, openly challenging church leaders and calling for restoration of old ways. Bold rebels risked execution, but gained enormous influence among populations that felt spiritually abandoned by forced baptism. Their public demonstrations of supernatural power, controlling weather patterns, healing diseases that prayers could not cure, and accurately predicting future events, provided compelling evidence that the old gods retained their strength despite official abandonment. Novgorod's uprising of 1071 exemplified this open defiance. Two sorcerer priests appeared during a time of famine, claiming that old powers were punishing the region for abandoning ancestral veneration. They demanded that populations return to ancient ways and threatened divine retribution against anyone who continued following the new teachings. Their message resonated powerfully with people suffering material hardship, while being told that their inherited sources of supernatural assistance were now forbidden. rebel leaders performed dramatic demonstrations of their continued connection to otherworldly forces. They allegedly controlled rainfall, caused rivers to flow backward, and made the earth tremble through their incantations. Whether these phenomena resulted from genuine divine intervention, clever stagecraft, or coincidental natural events mattered less than their effect on populations desperate for evidence that their ancestral powers had not truly abandoned them. Prince Gleb's response revealed the violent measures that church officials were willing to employ to suppress pagan revival. Rather than attempting to refute the sorcerer's claims through theological argument or competing displays of miraculous power, he ordered their immediate execution along with hundreds of supporters. The brutal suppression sent a clear message that defiance of church rule would be met with deadly force, regardless of popular support. Still, even spectacular violence could not eliminate the deeper currents that sustained old ways. Execution of prominent rebel leaders often transformed them into martyrs whose memory inspired continued opposition to church dominance. Secret shrines were established at burial sites of executed shamans, and their teachings were preserved through hidden networks that proved remarkably resilient to official persecution. Regional variations in rebellious patterns reflected local political conditions and the strength of inherited institutions. Western Slavic territories, where Germanic and Frankish influence had been gradually increasing for decades, experienced more sustained conflict as populations that had successfully resisted earlier baptism attempts found themselves facing renewed pressure from multiple directions. The Wendish Crusade of 1147 represented the culmination of church military pressure against Baltic Slavic strongholds that had maintained independence through superior naval power and strategic alliances with other pagan peoples. Unlike earlier efforts that relied primarily on missionary activity and diplomatic persuasion, this campaign explicitly aimed at destroying pagan military capacity while forcing mass conversions through conquest and occupation. Pelagian defiance centered around great temple complexes that had served as both spiritual and political centers for generations. Arcona's fall in 1168 marked the end of organized pagan military opposition in the Baltic region, but the campaign required sustained siege warfare against defenders who fought with the desperation of people protecting their most sacred sites. Danish King Valdemar's forces needed months to breach fortifications surrounding Svetovid's sanctuary, and even then, victory required betrayal by local inhabitants who had been promised favorable treatment in exchange for cooperation. Svetovid's four-faced statue destruction sent shockwaves throughout remaining pagan territories. This idol, which had stood for centuries as a symbol of divine protection and regional independence, was publicly burned while devoted followers were forced to watch. Sacred horses that had provided omens for decisions were slaughtered, and temple treasures accumulated over generations were distributed among warriors as spoils of conquest. Systematic dismantling of Arcona involved more than simple destruction of religious symbols. The conquering forces deliberately humiliated the defeated population by forcing them to participate in desecrating their own holy sites. Former priests were compelled to break apart ceremonial objects with their own hands, while temple servants were made to carry fuel for the fires that consumed religious artifacts. These psychological tactics aimed to break the spiritual resistance of the population by demonstrating the complete powerlessness of their former gods. Bohemian groups, facing pressure from the expanding Holy Roman Empire, adopted different survival strategies, emphasizing withdrawal to defensible mountain strongholds rather than direct confrontation. Highland refugees allowed old ways to continue in isolation, while avoiding catastrophic battles that had destroyed Baltic strongholds. Some of these settlements maintained independence for decades, creating temporary kingdoms in regions too remote and difficult for church armies to effectively occupy. Polish territories experienced complex patterns of rebellion and accommodation, as different regions responded differently to baptism pressures. The uprising led by Michał in the 1030s demonstrated that even officially converted areas could revert to pagan ways when political circumstances allowed. This rebellion combined ancient spiritual revival with resistance to foreign political influence, as populations that resented both church rule and German cultural dominance found common cause in defending old ways. Croatian highland settlements developed perhaps the most successful long-term strategies, using the complex terrain of Dalmatian mountains to create sanctuary zones where old ways could continue beyond the reach of coastal officials who had accepted Byzantine influence. These isolated enclaves preserved not only spiritual observances, but also distinctive cultural habits that would eventually influence broader development of South Slavic identity. Underground survival networks emerged throughout baptized territories, as settlements developed sophisticated methods for preserving ancient knowledge while avoiding official persecution. Traveling storytellers served as crucial links in these networks, carrying songs, stories, and procedural instructions between scattered groups of secret practitioners. Their performances appeared to be simple entertainment, but initiated listeners could decode hidden spiritual content that preserved essential knowledge. Folk songs became vehicles for maintaining mythological understanding, with old divine narratives disguised as secular ballads about heroes, magical creatures, and supernatural adventures. Complex symbolism embedded in these compositions allowed initiated practitioners to reconstruct ritual procedures, seasonal observances, and protective methods from seemingly innocent musical entertainment. Work songs preserved knowledge related to agricultural cycles, with specific melodies and verses sung during planting, harvesting, and food preparation, containing instructions for invoking otherworldly assistance. These habits could be maintained openly, since they appeared to be merely inherited work customs rather than forbidden religious activities. Wedding observances became particularly important vehicles for preserving old spiritual elements, as the church initially focused more on eliminating public temple veneration than on reforming domestic celebrations. Ancient marriage rituals, fertility rites, and protective observances could be conducted alongside wedding masses, creating syncretic gatherings that satisfied official requirements while maintaining essential connections to inherited ways. Funeral habits offered another opportunity for preserving old elements within officially approved contexts. While bodies were buried in consecrated cemeteries with appropriate services, families continued including grave goods, conducting memorial feasts, and maintaining communication with the dead through methods that predated arrival of Byzantine priests. These habits could often be justified as local cultural traditions rather than forbidden religious activities. The persistence of ancestral veneration created particular challenges for church authorities, as the boundary between honoring deceased relatives and worshipping pagan spirits often proved difficult to define clearly. Many families maintained elaborate shrines dedicated to departed ancestors, conducted regular feeding rituals for the dead, and sought guidance from deceased relatives through divination practices that closely resembled pre-conversion worship patterns. Martyrdom and forced baptism created powerful emotional bonds between settlements and their old spiritual ways. People who had witnessed execution of beloved shamans, destruction of ancient shrines, and forced abandonment of protective rites developed deep resentment toward church rule that could persist for generations. These traumatic memories became focal points for rebel movements that emerged whenever political circumstances allowed old ways to resurface. Sacred groves presented particular challenges for church officials, as these natural sanctuaries could not be easily destroyed or adapted to new purposes. Many settlements continued conducting secret gatherings in woodland locations that had been consecrated through centuries of ancient veneration, adapting their methods to avoid detection while preserving essential connections to these powerful sites. The persistence of inherited healing arts created ongoing tensions between church rule and popular needs. Settlements that had relied on shamanic healers for medical treatment found clergy unable to provide equivalent services, creating situations where officially forbidden practitioners continued operating in secret to meet essential healthcare requirements. Herbal knowledge, seasonal timing of medical treatments, and other worldly dimensions of illness and healing had been thoroughly integrated into old understanding. Church officials could forbid ancient rituals, but they could not easily replace practical medical knowledge that these forbidden methods had preserved. This created opportunities for inherited practitioners to maintain activities by emphasizing medical rather than spiritual aspects of their services. Architectural evidence reveals complex processes of transition in many settlements. Churches were often built directly on top of destroyed temples, incorporating stones, timber, and even decorative elements from earlier structures. While this demonstrated church triumph over ancient religion, it also created spaces where old energies were believed to persist, allowing baptized populations to maintain subtle connections to their sacred sites. Even as organized rebellion gradually diminished under sustained church pressure, hidden preservation of ancient knowledge ensured that essential elements of pre-baptism spirituality would survive to influence emerging synthesis between doctrine and Slavic cultural traditions. Burning idols and destroyed temples marked the end of official paganism, but they could not eliminate deeper currents that would continue flowing beneath the surface of society for centuries to come. The long-term success of this cultural preservation demonstrated the resilience of folk traditions when faced with systematic suppression. While the visible structures of organized paganism collapsed relatively quickly under political and military pressure, the underlying spiritual worldview that had shaped Slavic consciousness for millennia proved remarkably adaptable to new circumstances. Elements of this ancient heritage would continue to emerge in unexpected forms, creating a distinctively Slavic approach to Christianity that preserved essential connections to the land, the seasons, and the spiritual forces that governed daily life. Beneath the gleaming domes of newly constructed churches and the solemn chanting of liturgies, an older rhythm continued pulsing through the daily lives of supposedly converted populations. Though princes and bishops proclaimed the triumph of the cross over old gods, peasant mothers still whispered protective charms over sleeping children. Fishermen poured libations into rivers before casting nets, and village-wise women gathered herbs according to lunar cycles that predated any cathedral's construction by centuries. This parallel existence, known to scholars as dvoevery or dual faith, represented neither simple defiance nor gradual accommodation, but rather a complex synthesis that transformed both inherited paganism and imported doctrine into something entirely new. Populations that had been forced to abandon public temples and official pantheons discovered creative ways to preserve essential supernatural relationships, despite appearing to conform to church requirements. Veneration of holy figures provided the most obvious avenue for maintaining connections with divine powers, whose characteristics closely resembled displaced gods. Elijah the prophet, whose feast day coincided with the height of summer thunderstorm periods, absorbed many of Perun's attributes and responsibilities. When lightning split the sky and thunder shook village homes, peasants invoked Elijah's protection, using prayers that closely resembled old formulas once addressed to the thunder god himself. Churches dedicated to the biblical prophet were often built on hilltops that had previously hosted Perun's oak groves, and their congregations continued leaving offerings at these elevated sites during summer storms. Though officially these gifts honored the Hebrew prophet, their timing, placement, and accompanying rituals maintained essential continuity with pre-baptism practices that had connected settlements to supernatural forces controlling weather and agricultural success. Paraskeva Piatnitsa emerged as the successor to Mokosh, assuming the goddess's authority over women's concerns, textile production, and domestic prosperity. Friday became her special day, Piatnitsa literally meaning Friday in Slavonic, when women refrained from household labor and conducted ceremonies that closely resembled moon-centered rituals once performed for the pagan fertility deity. Wells and springs dedicated to this holy woman attracted female pilgrims who brought offerings of bread, cloth, and personal ornaments during their quest for assistance with pregnancy, childbirth, and family protection. These sites often coincided with locations where Mokosh had been worshipped for centuries, and the activities conducted there preserved many elements of the goddess cult within an officially acceptable framework. Vlas inherited the pastoral responsibilities once held by Velas, becoming the patron of domestic animals and protector of herds. Peasant settlements celebrated his feast day with ceremonies that blessed livestock, marked the beginning of spring grazing periods, and invoked protection against wolves and diseases that threatened their animals. Icons of this holy figure often depicted him with a long beard and rustic clothing that recalled artistic representations of the cattle god. George emerged as perhaps the most complex example of this saint-god synthesis. His role as dragon slayer resonated powerfully with populations familiar with Perun's cosmic battles against serpentine forces of chaos. Spring festivals celebrating his victory over the dragon incorporated many elements of the old myth cycle, including processional rituals that reenacted the cosmic struggle between order and disorder. Military groups adopted this warrior figure as their patron, seeing in his identity a continuation of the martial religion that had once centered on Perun and other war deities. His icon accompanied armies into battle. His feast day marked the beginning of campaign periods, and victory celebrations honored his intercession, but maintained many of the ritual elements that had once characterized pagan warfare. Agricultural festivals underwent particularly creative transformations, as settlements found ways to maintain essential cyclical ceremonies within ostensibly church frameworks. Cupola Night, the midsummer celebration of fertility and solar power, became the feast of John the Baptist, yet actual festivities retained most of their pagan characteristics. Bonfires blazed on hilltops and riverbanks. Young people jumped over flames to ensure good fortune, and magical herbs were gathered during night hours when their supernatural properties reached peak effectiveness. Maslenitsa, the week-long festival preceding Lent, preserved old celebration of winter's defeat and spring's approaching return. Officially, this represented preparation for the austere Lenten period. Yet actual practices, consumption of pancakes symbolizing the returning sun, burning of winter effigies, and raucous carnival atmosphere marking the week's activities, maintained essential continuity with pre-baptism cyclical rituals. Pancakes themselves carried deep symbolic significance that transcended their official role as the last rich foods before Lenten fasting. Round and golden like the sun, they were prepared according to old recipes passed down through generations of women who understood their connection to solar symbolism and fertility magic. Communal preparation and consumption of these pancakes created temporary abundance that symbolized prosperity spring would bring to faithful populations. Effigy burning during Maslenitsa preserved one of the most dramatic elements of old religion. Straw figures that were constructed, paraded through villages, and finally consigned to bonfires represented Marzana, the death goddess whose annual destruction marked winter's end and life's renewal. Though priests might bless these proceedings as symbolic preparation for spiritual renewal, participants understood them as continuation of cosmic dramas that ensured cyclical transitions. Winter solstice celebrations transformed into Christmas ceremonies, but retained many of their old characteristics. Kolyada, the carol singing that marked the year's longest night, continued as nativity celebration, yet songs themselves often preserved pre-baptism, mythological content disguised as entertainment. Carol singers went from house to house, carrying star-shaped decorations that recalled old solar symbols, and their songs invoked blessings for agricultural prosperity and household protection. The 12 days between Christmas and Epiphany maintained their character as a liminal period when supernatural forces were especially active and protective measures were particularly necessary. Households conducted rituals to ensure the coming year's prosperity. Families gathered to share special foods containing symbolic significance, and settlements performed dramatic presentations that reenacted cosmic myths within the framework of nativity celebrations. Village clergy often found themselves in impossible positions as they attempted to minister to congregations whose daily lives remained thoroughly integrated with pre-baptism activities. Rural priests, typically drawn from local populations and sharing their parishioners' cultural background, frequently developed flexible approaches that accommodated old customs despite maintaining formal adherence to church requirements. Many priests learned to distinguish between essential doctrine and cultural habits that could be tolerated or even blessed if they did not directly contradict core theological principles. This practical accommodation allowed settlements to maintain important cyclical ceremonies, protective rituals, and healing methods that met genuine spiritual needs, despite avoiding direct confrontation with church officials. Domestic religious life became particularly complex as households attempted to balance official requirements with old ways that governed daily survival and prosperity. Morning and evening prayers might include both approved formulas and traditional invocations for household spirits. Icons of holy figures shared domestic sacred space with protective charms and cyclical decorations that carried pre-baptism symbolic significance. Women's religious habits proved particularly resistant to complete transformation, as the domestic sphere remained largely beyond direct clerical supervision. Traditional knowledge about herbal medicine, protective magic, and fertility methods continued passing through maternal lineages, often incorporating church symbols and prayers, despite preserving essential pre-baptism techniques. Textile production retained many of its old magical associations, as women continued creating protective patterns in their weaving and embroidery. These designs, though they might include crosses and other approved symbols, also incorporated traditional motifs that connected finished products with cyclical patterns, protective forces, and cosmic order governing domestic prosperity. Healing habits represented perhaps the most persistent area of dual faith accommodation. Village-wise women adapted their inherited knowledge to include prayers and holy invocations, despite maintaining herbal, ritual, and diagnostic techniques that had proven effective for generations. Church officials, recognizing practical value of these medical services, often tolerated methods they might otherwise condemn as superstitious. Marriage ceremonies became elaborate syntheses of church and inherited elements, as couples sought both religious blessing and supernatural protection that old customs had provided for new families. Wedding celebrations might include church services, feast customs, and protective rituals that ensured fertility and domestic harmony. Folk tales and songs preserved mythological knowledge in forms that could be shared openly without attracting church criticism. Stories about magical animals, supernatural adventures, and heroic achievements often contained thinly disguised versions of old divine narratives, allowing initiated listeners to reconstruct essential mythological understanding from apparently secular entertainment. Even as the new faith gradually gained deeper acceptance and genuine religious commitment among Slavic populations, these persistent pagan elements continued influencing religious practice in ways that shaped church spirituality itself. Result was neither pure doctrine nor preserved paganism, but a unique synthesis that would characterize Eastern European religious consciousness for centuries to come. Long after the last temples crumbled and the final Volkvi fell silent, old gods found refuge in the most unlikely sanctuaries. The voices of storytellers, melodies of wandering minstrels, and imagination of children gathered around winter hearths. What could not survive as organized religion transformed into something far more resilient. Living narrative that could adapt, disguise itself, and emerge in new forms whenever circumstances allowed. The deities banished from altars found new life in the creative power of folk imagination. Bailani, those epic poems chronicling legendary champions, became vessels for preserving sacred consciousness within seemingly acceptable formats. These narratives of mighty warriors, enchanted adventures, and cosmic battles appeared to celebrate valor of knights and glory of early kingdoms. Yet initiated listeners could recognize celestial dramas that had once played out in conflicts between thunder gods and chaos serpents. Behind the human heroes stood the shadowy outlines of ancient deities, still acting out their eternal roles. Dobrynya Nikitic emerged as the most transparent example of godly transformation into heroic legend. This epic champion, whose very name echoed the Slavonic word for good or brave, inherited the thunder deity's role as serpent slayer and protector of universal order. His legendary battle with the dragon at the Puchai River maintained essential elements of Perun's eternal struggle against powers of chaos, complete with rescue of captured maidens who represented life-giving rains stolen by drought-bringing monsters. In epic narratives, Dobrynya wielded otherworldly weapons that recalled lightning bolts of the thunder god. His horse possessed mystical abilities to cross impossible distances and survive otherworldly dangers. His victories restored balance to the world and brought prosperity to grateful populations. Yet all these sacred attributes were carefully embedded within stories of a human champion serving a kingdom, making them acceptable entertainment that avoided direct challenges to established religious authority. Specific details of Dobrynya's equipment revealed layers of encoded meaning, connecting him to his godly predecessor. His miraculous sword, which could cut through any armor and never dulled in battle, functioned like Perun's lightning that could penetrate any defense. His silken whip, capable of binding even otherworldly creatures, recalled the thunder god's control over chaotic powers. His golden helmet, which protected him from enchanted attacks, symbolized solar associations that had linked thunder deities to universal illumination. Ilya Muromets, greatest of all epic champions, combined elements of both suffering and earthbound strength that reflected complex relationships between human settlements and sacred powers governing their existence. His legendary paralysis during the first 30 years of life, followed by miraculous healing and acquisition of otherworldly strength, echoed patterns of shamanic initiation and godly transformation that had characterized older religious understanding. Kaliki, wandering pilgrims who appeared at Ilya's humble dwelling to grant him mobility and power, functioned as sacred messengers in disguise. Their gift of strength that could move mountains and uproot oak trees connected the warrior directly to earth powers that had been central to pre-conversion consciousness. His subsequent adventures maintained holy themes within a framework where he served Prince Vladimir, but kept connections to otherworldly energies that transcended purely human authority. Ilya's famous club, hewn from a single piece of oak and weighing more than any ordinary man could lift, served multiple symbolic functions within epic narrative. Oak had been Perun's sacred tree, and weapons crafted from this wood inherited some of the thunder god's power. Club's enormous weight suggested that only someone blessed with godly strength could wield it effectively. Its ability to shatter castle walls and defeat entire armies single-handedly demonstrated overwhelming energy that earth powers could bring to bear when properly channeled. Alyosha Popovich, whose name identified him as the priest's son, represented the trickster champion tradition that recalled Velas's role as boundary crosser and transformer of conventional order. Unlike straightforward valor of Dobrynya or overwhelming strength of Ilya, Alyosha achieved victories through cunning, shape-shifting, and clever manipulation of otherworldly rules. His adventures often involved crossing between realms, outwitting sacred beings, and accomplishing impossible tasks through wit rather than strength. Musical instruments that accompanied Alyosha on his adventures carried particular significance within epic framework. His gusli, a stringed instrument whose melodies could charm both humans and otherworldly beings, recalled power of music to bridge different realms of existence. His ability to sing enemies to sleep, summon helpful spirits through melodic invocation, and transform emotional atmosphere of any gathering demonstrated enchanted properties that civilizations had attributed to properly performed musical arts. Epic champions operated within a landscape that maintained many features of the old cosmological cosmos. Kiev, though historically real, functioned in Bylany as a sacred center comparable to Universal Mountain or World Tree of earlier belief systems. Prince Vladimir, though based on the historical ruler, appeared in these narratives as a figure whose authority derived from sacred sanction, and whose court served as meeting place between human and otherworldly realms. Transformation of godly content into heroic epic allowed storytellers to maintain complex theological concepts despite avoiding direct reference to forbidden deities. Universal battles that had once explained cycles of seasons, weather patterns, and agricultural rhythms could continue as entertaining accounts of legendary warriors whose victories ensured prosperity and security of their communities. The sacred drama continued on a stage populated by human actors. Wonder narratives and fairy stories provided even more flexible vehicles for maintaining sacred understanding, as their fantastic elements could be dismissed as mere entertainment, yet actually transmit essential wisdom to those who possessed keys to decode their meanings. Skazki wrapped old understanding in layers of symbolic narrative that could survive centuries of religious and political change while preserving the essential spiritual heritage. Baba Yaga emerged as one of the most complex and persistent figures in this transformed mythology. Her iron teeth, her hut that rotated on chicken legs, and her role as guardian of boundaries between the world of living and realm of dead maintained concepts about liminal spaces and threshold guardians. Champions who sought to enter the otherworld had to pass through her domain, demonstrating proper respect and understanding protocols that governed otherworldly encounters. Her peculiar dwelling revealed multiple layers of symbolic meaning, connecting her to pre-conversion religious understanding. Chicken legs that supported her hut recalled bird symbolism associated with sky deities and shamanic flight. Hut's ability to rotate suggested universal wheel that marked transitions between seasons. Fence of human bones that surrounded her property demonstrated deadly serious nature of otherworld encounters, and price that might be paid for spiritual understanding. Ambiguous nature of Baba Yaga's character, sometimes helpful, sometimes hostile, always dangerous, reflected pre-conversion understanding that otherworldly energies operated according to their own logic rather than human moral categories. She might assist champions who approached her correctly, yet destroy those who failed to observe proper protocols. Her tests revealed character, wisdom, and readiness rather than simple good or evil. Koshai, the Deathless, embodied winter-death deity, whose annual defeat ensured renewal of life and return of spring. His peculiar vulnerability, death hidden in a needle, in an egg, in a duck, in a hare, in a chest buried beneath a great oak tree, maintained shamanic concepts about separation of soul from body and universal geography that connected different realms of existence. His repeated defeats in countless tales enacted the eternal cycle of seasons, complex sequence of nested containers that protected Koshai's life essence, reflected sophisticated understanding about layered nature of existence and multiple barriers that separated ordinary consciousness from deepest truths. Each level of protection required different skills to penetrate: physical strength to dig up the chest, hunting ability to catch the hare, swimming prowess to retrieve the duck, delicate manipulation to extract the egg, and precise timing to break the needle at crucial moment. Champions who sought to defeat Koshai had to undertake otherworld journeys that mirrored transition from winter death to spring renewal. Their quests typically required assistance from grateful animals, enchanted helpers, and other worldly allies who had been aided through previous acts of kindness or wisdom. This pattern maintained understanding about reciprocal relationships that connected all levels of existence in the cosmic web. Firebird narratives, whose brilliant plumage illuminated darkest nights and whose voice could heal any sorrow, represented solar mythology that had been central to agricultural religious consciousness. Stories of champions who captured or befriended this mystical creature maintained awareness about sun's daily journey, cycles of seasons, and universal energies that ensured continuation of life on Earth despite the darkness of winter. Feathers from this mystical bird, which retained their luminous properties even when separated from the creature, functioned as talismans that connected their bearers to solar power. These enchanted objects could light the way through otherworldly darkness, provide warmth during otherworld winters, and serve as tokens of godly favor when presented to earthly rulers. Difficulty of obtaining such feathers, requiring dangerous journeys to the edge of the world, emphasized precious nature of solar blessing and courage, required to maintain connection with celestial energies. Timing of storytelling itself became a vehicle for maintaining consciousness. Winter months, when agricultural work ceased and families gathered indoors for extended periods, became the season for sharing accounts that connected listeners to their heritage. Long nights provided appropriate settings for narratives that explored boundaries between ordinary reality and otherworld dimensions. The telling itself became a ritual act of preservation. Professional storytellers developed sophisticated techniques for encoding wisdom within apparently simple entertainment. Repetitive formulas, mystical numbers, and symbolic objects all carried meanings that initiated listeners could recognize, yet remain invisible to casual observers. Opening phrases like, "Once upon a time, in a certain kingdom," established narrative within mythic rather than historical time, signaling that events described belong to realm of archetypal truth rather than factual occurrence. Use of specific numbers within these accounts carried particular significance, connecting them to cosmological understanding. 3 represented vertical division of existence into upper, middle, and lower worlds. 7 reflected sacred nature of planetary cycles and completion of universal processes. 12 connected to annual cycle and zodiacal division of celestial space. 9, as 3 times 3, suggested ultimate perfection and completion of all possible transformations. Children's games unconsciously maintained themes and techniques through play activities that appeared to have no religious content. Circle dances that followed solar patterns, singing games that invoked protective formulas, and dramatic play that reenacted universal conflicts all served to transmit essential inherited understanding while providing entertainment and social bonding for young participants. The youngest members of society became unwitting carriers of ancient wisdom. Wedding chants maintained fertility magic within framework of matrimonial celebration, as melodies and verses sung during marriage ceremonies continued invoking otherworldly assistance for new couples, yet appeared to be merely inherited customs. These chants often included references to godly figures, protective symbols, and actions that connected contemporary celebrations to old practices that ensured prosperity and continuation of family lines. Funeral laments maintained connections with departed souls through musical expressions of grief that also functioned as communication with the dead. Specific melodies, verbal formulas, and emotional patterns that characterized mourning chants kept protocols for ensuring that deceased family members received proper recognition and continued assistance from their living descendants who remained responsible for their well-being beyond death. Work chants coordinated community labor, yet maintained understanding related to agricultural cycles, craft production, and cosmic dimensions of various occupations. Specific melodies accompanied different types of work: planting, harvesting, weaving, construction. And these chants often contained invocations, protective formulas, and practices disguised as practical coordination of group activities. Labor and sacred understanding remained inseparable in daily life. Persistence of consciousness through these various narrative and inherited vehicles ensured that essential elements of pre-conversion awareness remained available to populations that maintained inherited understanding necessary to access and interpret these disguised practices. Though great temples had fallen and official pantheons had been forgotten, underlying awareness that had shaped Slavic religious consciousness for millennia continued flowing through collective memory. Even as Christianity gradually gained deeper acceptance and genuine religious commitment among Slavic populations, these persistent elements continued influencing expression in ways that enriched rather than contradicted emerging synthesis between inherited customs and imported religious forms. Result was a uniquely Slavic form of consciousness that could satisfy both church requirements and deeper needs that connected families to their heritage across countless generations. Modern scholars studying Slavic folklore continue discovering content embedded within seemingly secular inherited heritage. Folk chants collected in remote villages contain godly names, universal geography, and techniques that had been thought lost for centuries. Crafts maintain symbolic patterns that encode wisdom about protective magic, practices, and communication with otherworldly energies that once sustained entire civilizations. Transformation of myth into folklore represents not death of religion, but its metamorphosis into forms that could survive political change yet maintain their essential content. In voices of storytellers, melodies of chants, and imagination of children who still believe in mystical creatures, gods of the Slavic peoples continue their eternal journey through changing seasons of human consciousness, as resilient as the cultures that first gave them form.